Please take all my appreciation and thanks to everybody as uttered. I will not take the time to repeat those.
Excuse me. Could you please have somebody lift that microphone?
Rabbi, thank you so much. Rabbi is a multi-purpose, fantastic friend. Thank you, sir. It truly is a privilege to be here in this temple. There are many statues of Gandhi, different parts of the world, but the last several months there was one less statue, because in Ghana, in Accra, the capital, there was a Gandhi statue on the university campus there. And many students in Ghana protested and said that Gandhi, when he was in South Africa, was some kind of a racist, they alleged. And so the statue of Gandhi on the university campus of Accra has been removed. And if you Google Gandhi in Africa, this question comes up with some frequency. So I thought I would examine this, since I am supposed to be a historian. So was Gandhi a racist when he was in South Africa? That is my conversation with you. Some of you are shocked. It's good to be shocked. But it's good to examine these allegations too. So Gandhi was for the first 18 years in a small place in Western India. He spent 3 years as a student in London from the age of 18 to 21. And then between the ages of 23 and 44, 21 years, from 1893 to 1914, he was in South Africa. Except that South Africa was not yet South Africa. It became a Union of South Africa in 1910. So when Gandhi first went there in 1893, he went to the province of Natal, which was a self-governing province of the British Empire. Then he was for some time in Transvaal, which was another province. To begin with, it was a province that the Afrikaners, the people of Dutch origin or European origin, other than British white South Africans, they controlled. There was a war between the Afrikaners, or the Boers as they were called. Some of you have heard of the Boer War? Well, this is a very learned class. So yes, Gandhi took part as an ambulance worker on behalf of the British as against the Boers in that war. So it was in South Africa that Gandhi had these very remarkable experiences. And those of you who have seen the famous Attenborough movie have seen how Gandhi was pushed out of the train. And then he stayed and fought back. And so what were Gandhi's aims when he was in South Africa? He did not go there to change the world. He did not go there, as I understand it from his life, to remedy every ill that Southern Africa was facing at the time, not yet South Africa. He was concerned, he went there, of course, as a lawyer. He was hired by a very rich Indian businessman, a Muslim from Gujarat, from the same part of India that Gandhi was raised in, who had a quarrel with a cousin. It was not even a quarrel between the Indian race and the white race. It was a quarrel between one Indian and his relative. And it was a very big sum of money involved, and Gandhi was hired as a lawyer. So he went there to gain some new experience, to make some money. He had some debts to clear. But then these encounters happened and changes began to occur in his life. So in his early years in South Africa, Gandhi's aim became to improve the situation of the Indian community in South Africa. That was his goal. It was a limited goal, certainly not a universal goal. He wasn't there to try and remedy the great wrongs that the blacks in South Africa were facing. It was the Indian community and its needs that he was trying to meet. And in the course of his requests or petitions, since he was a highly trained lawyer, he was quite bright, so he became the representative of the Indian community and became the leader of the Indian community there, and the spokesperson. And so he made requests or demands, then he led agitations, and this wonderful word, which is correctly pronounced by the rabbi, satyagraha, truth force. So he applied that, and with remarkable success. While asking the authorities, provincial authorities to begin with, and they were also, of course, controlled by London, which was the head of the empire. So he would make requests of the local government, he would make requests of London for improving the status of the Indians, who were treated quite badly. So in asking that the Indians should have the same rights as the whites, there's no doubt that he had made some statements, wrote petitions on behalf of the Indian community, in which he compared the Indians very favorably with the Africans of South Africa in terms of education, in terms of other attainments. And he claimed that the South Africans, blacks compared with the Indians, were very poor in education. And he used some derogatory language, no doubt about it. And he felt that they should get the same rights as the whites were getting. So some of those utterances were quite offensive. Today they would sound very offensive indeed. So that was one set of remarks that came from Gandhi, which today we would deplore. And there was something else that happened. When he started his non-violent fight, he and other people of Indian origin, they were supported by many others in South Africa at the time. Many of them were imprisoned, Gandhi himself, many times. And he was also placed as a convict with others who were accused of crime. And once or twice he was in a cell with black Africans from South Africa who had been convicted of various kinds of crime. And in the cell, Gandhi found it pretty difficult, and some of the conduct of his fellow convicts, South Africans who had been convicted for various kinds of crime. So Gandhi felt quite scared and offended by some of these remarks and some of the gestures that were made. And so he described his reaction to this also in not very courteous language about how these black co-prisoners of his were conducting themselves. Then there was a third thing which should be acknowledged, that Gandhi referred to the blacks in South Africa in the language that was used by everybody in South Africa at the time, by the whites, by the Indians, and also by the blacks. They were called Kafirs, K-A-F-F-I-R-S, which was a derogatory term. Today, nobody would use that today, but it was used by everybody, and Gandhi also, a few instances, used those expressions. There are two young professors in South Africa of Indian origin who about 3-4 years ago wrote a book called The South African Gandhi, and they instanced all these remarks that Gandhi had made. And they said that Gandhi did not fight for equal rights for the blacks of South Africa, which is true, and tried to imply that Gandhi was some kind of a racist. Now, one or two things that are worth noting. In this book, which I've read carefully from beginning to end, so there is no reference in this big book to any remark made by anybody either in India at the time or in South Africa at the time, white, black, Indian, criticizing Gandhi for those remarks that he made at that stage. Not one. So Gandhi was reflecting a prevalent attitude at the time. Deplorable attitude, undoubtedly, from our standpoint. But it's worth noting, rightly or wrongly, we can deplore the fact that nobody objected. But there is no evidence in this book that anybody, whether in India or in South Africa, or in England at that time, objected to what Gandhi was saying. This is something to remember. And also, some of you may have heard, if you've not heard, you should hear of a remarkable man called, thank you, sir. Now I'll have to make sure that that does not tip over. So, that's, wow.
Better and better.
So John Langalibele Dube. Who has heard of John Langalibele Dube? D-U-B-E. Nobody is here. Amazing man, one of the founders of the African National Congress. He was a black South African belonging to a princely Zulu family. He was born just 2 years after Gandhi was born. He died 2 years after Gandhi's birth. He was more or less Gandhi's contemporary. And these two became friends and were close associates. Dube also came to the US to study. He was in Ohio. Now Dube also used the similar language as Gandhi did at the time. And Dube is indeed one of the founders of the African National Congress. And it's worth noting that Dube had a student. And his name too you have not heard, but you should have heard it, and you will now hear it. Albert Luthuli, L-U-T-H-U-L-I, and sometimes spelled L-U-T-U-L-I, Albert Luthuli. He became the president of the African National Congress and was given the Nobel Prize in 1961 for his fight against apartheid. Well before Nelson Mandela or Archbishop Desmond Tutu got their Nobels, Albert Luthuli got his Nobel in South Africa. Nelson Mandela, in his book or books, writes about Luthuli, and he describes him as a passionate disciple of Gandhi. He was absolutely, totally committed to non-violent struggle for justice. And Luthuli was in the United States in 1948, that's the year when Gandhi was killed, and he gave talks in different parts of the US. And one of these talks was at Harvard University in Washington, D.C., which, as you know, is, yes, African American university and has been there for some time. And so this is what Luthuli, when he was touring in the United States, said at Harvard University in 1948, quote, "I have no doubt that Gandhi's efforts for his people, Indian people, I have no doubt, these are the words of Luthuli, I have no doubt that Gandhi's efforts for his people inspired people such as Dr. John Dewey and others to concern themselves with seeking rights for their people," quote unquote. These words are quoted in a biography of Luthuli, written by Scott Cooper. And these words, the handwritten draft in Luthuli's own handwriting, in which he says that Dube was inspired by Gandhi. That document is preserved in the Luthuli Museum in Natal. Now these are Mandela's remarks also about Gandhi's early comments about Africans. Nelson Mandela would say, Gandhi had been initially shocked that Indians were classified with natives in prison. All in all, Gandhi must be forgiven these prejudices and judged in the context of the time and the circumstances. This is Mandela's view. Now, when we look at this allegation, we understand that even people we revere, we respect, are very human people, and they make serious mistakes. They say things or do things which today we would not approve of. But it's useful to look at this because we are often finding persons from history. It may be Gandhi today, it may be somebody else. We look at their lives and we find that sometimes what they said or did does not meet with our approval. But the question to ask is this person typical of his period? Are we blaming him for his or her faults, or is it really the defect of an age itself? It could be both. It could be either or one or the other or both. Now, it has to be acknowledged that in fighting only for Indian rights in South Africa, in merely setting an example for the Africans to follow in the future, but not directly engaging immediately for African rights, Gandhi did represent the weakness of his time and age. He did not transcend his time and age. That would be a very legitimate criticism. So whoever we are looking at, whose story, whether it's Abraham Lincoln, whether it is anybody else, we look at what they said or did not say, what they did or did not do. So I imagine we have to look at them in the context of the time. And the reason why I stress that this detailed book by these two young professors, where they list some of Gandhi's unfortunate remarks at that time, that book does not contain any single criticism by anybody in India at that time, anybody in England at that time, any African or white or Indian in South Africa at the time, shows that Gandhi's unfortunate remarks really belonged more to the period than to him. But there's one thing else that we should recognize, that although essentially Gandhi did not transcend his time at that time when he was a young man in South Africa, and he confined himself to fighting for the Indians and sometimes made these offensive statements about Africans. In May 1908, in Johannesburg, there was a meeting of the YMCA. This is what Gandhi said at that meeting, and this was published in the newspapers at the time. In studying the Indian question, writes Gandhi, or says Gandhi in Johannesburg, I've endeavored to study the question as it affects the Africans and the Chinese. There were also some Chinese in South Africa at the time, and Gandhi collaborated very closely. The Indians and the Chinese worked closely together. In studying the Indian question, I've endeavored to study the question as it affects the Chinese and the Africans, rather the Africans and the Chinese. It seems to me that both the Africans and the Asiatics have advanced the empire as a whole. Now, in 1908, Gandhi was still a believer in the empire, believe it or not. The man who would later shake the empire and start the process of African and Asian countries liberating themselves from British rule, believed that the empire might have some good things to do in the world. Because it was said on behalf of the empire, rightly or wrongly, that we believe in equality of religion, that people of every religion, every race would have equal rights in the empire. This was a thought that Gandhi liked. He hoped it would be practiced. It seems to me that both the Africans and the Asiatics have advanced the empire as a whole. We can hardly think of South Africa without the African races. They, the African races, are still in the history of the world's learners, able-bodied and intelligent men as they are, they cannot but be an asset for the empire. Continues Gandhi, if we look into the future, is it not a heritage we have to leave to posterity, that all the different races commingle and produce a civilization that perhaps the world has not yet seen? 1908, commingling. You know what that word means? And producing a civilization that perhaps the world has not yet seen? In that statement in 1908 in Johannesburg, Gandhi transcends his time. He envisions a future not yet realized in 2020, but he envisions that future. So when you examine that statement, and I have not come across any other statement in South Africa at that time, whether by an Indian or by an African, or by a white man that speaks of this vision of a commingled new civilization where all the races come together. So my assessment, as I analyze, and I analyze my grandfather, not as his grandson, but as a historian, if possible, as a judge. Is this man a racist? My conclusion, definitely not. Is this man imperfect? Absolutely. Is he limited in his goals? Yes, indeed, unfortunately. But is his goal something that others would emulate and all races would benefit from? Absolutely. So this is the sort of assessment that I've come to after studying this very important question of whether Gandhi was a racist when in South Africa. That's the end of my remarks. I hope we can have a discussion. Yes, sir.
Thank you. So following on your remarks last night about what you said about these remarks about British Empire and what you said last night about the effects in India of empire and colonialism made me think both the United States and India came out of the colonial experience, and so out of that British influence, you feel there any residual components of justice or culture or ethics that can give us hope?
So is your question about today's India, or is it a question about the British Empire? I'm a little unclear.
The United States and India,
yeah.
That what might still be residual from the Brits.
Yeah. Yeah. So, well, I think we can all, I think if a vote was taken, can we blame the British in India or the US? The vote would be in favor of blaming the British. Yes. But we can take that vote. But I would suggest, in my honest opinion, that that was the wrong question to ask. It's not a good enough question to ask. There was a remarkable Indian political leader, a Muslim. At different times, he closely collaborated with Gandhi. At other times, he opposed Gandhi. His name was Maulana Muhammad Ali. And he was asked about the British. Don't they divide and rule? Don't they divide and rule? Don't they divide and rule? His answer was, we divide and they rule. Yes, the British practiced divide and rule very effectively, very astutely, very deliberately. And there are tons and tons of documents to prove that. But it remains a fact that if Indians had refused to divide themselves, they would not have been divided, and they would not have been ruled. And likewise in the United States, that British imperialism and its clever, astute, divisive, dangerous policies could have been defeated earlier on if people had shown. So that's a very important question, I think. And yes, when he returned from South Africa a few years thereafter, Gandhi realized that the British Empire's ideals were only ideals on paper. They were not meant to be pursued in practice. And so he became a fierce foe of the empire. But he still said, I'm going to fight the British Empire, but I'm going to love the individual English person. That was a tough thing to say. And not a tough thing a very tough thing to persuade Indians to accept. But he did fight for that. But thank you, sir, for your question. Comments, questions? Yes.
I'm an avid follower of the Jefferson Hour, which is where Clay Jenkinson plays Thomas Jefferson every week on the radio. And the same questions are surrounding that. Was that, well, he was a slaveholder. Yes. Now they're taking his statues down. Well, the first 8 presidents were slaveholders, including George Washington. So You have to, as you said, look at what were the intentions, what were the other accomplishments, the overall accomplishments of that person during that time. Okay, that's all.
So that's a very valuable comment, and I think this question arises, so many controversies about Abraham Lincoln, also, some of the remarks he made. And they all have to be studied as dispassionately as we can, but remembering the context and remembering that the times do change. Times do change, and people's understandings grow. People are limited to begin with. John Dewey, Gandhi's close friend, by the way, in South Africa, and John Dewey also had a newspaper. Gandhi founded a newspaper. Gandhi printed John Dewey's newspapers in his little printing press. They were close colleagues, but John Dewey also did not fight for African rights at that stage. He said, we have to cooperate with the government. Rightly or wrongly, that was his attitude. So when we look at history, it is good to discover and recognize imperfections in people, whether it's Thomas Jefferson, Abraham Lincoln, Gandhi, or anyone. But it's also good to see those situations within their context. But thank you.
Was your grandfather alive when you were young, and could you share some of your experiences with him?
I will try. It's not directly related to Africa and Gandhi, but it's a very natural question. I will try to answer it. Yes, I was 12 and a half when Gandhi was killed. When he was going from 76 to 78, which is the age when he died or was killed, I was going from 10 to 12. My father, as Dr. Kapoor mentioned, was the editor of the Hindustan Times in New Delhi. And I went to school in that city. And that is where Gandhi spent much of the last 2 years of his life. So during that time, I saw a fair amount of him. We must recognize that, by the way, today so many Gandhi descendants are around, and they're often invited to speak about Gandhi. And many of them do. As I'm warning you, there are lots of Gandhi descendants, so you may be confronted with lots of them in the years to come, and then grandchildren will have their children. There will be great-grandchildren. But one reason why Gandhi became so strong and popular in India was that he did not give special attention to his family. Family first was not his motto. Rightly or wrongly, I'm just telling you what the facts were. Family first was not his motto. He did not have a home. He was born into a comfortable family, prestigious family. In his early years in South Africa, he became a successful lawyer. He made lots of money, but he gave up all his money to the community. Then he had no home of his own. He decided to accept poverty as his way of life. And that amassing money and wealth was to him an absolutely false goal, and he was not going to pursue it. That's what made him popular. See what a fantastic person he is. He does not put his family first. But today the criticism is, what a man, he didn't put his family first. So, returning to your question, there was no home of my grandfather to which we could go and spend times with him. And when we went to be with him, there were always other people who were wanting to meet him, and he was wanting to meet them too. And this particular period, 46 to 48, was when India was being partitioned. India was about to be freed. Great joy, partition, great disappointment, sorrow, violence and killing, great unhappiness. Many people were extremely unhappy, and they were determined to meet Gandhi because he was supposed to be the leader, and he hadn't made sure that people would not face these terrible problems. Or he was there, and that the government of India was led by people who were his followers, so if he could put in a word, their problems would be solved. So everybody wanted to meet him. So we, his grandchildren, had to be almost in line, waiting for our time with him. That's the reality. But when we did meet him, he was love itself, affection itself. He would hug his grandchildren and be very warm. And the conventional way in which young people met grandparents in those days was for the youngsters to bow a little before the grandparent. And the grandparent gave a big thump on the back to show his affection. And although he was an old man by this time, in those days in India, 78 was a very, very old age, just like 99 today. But he was thin and he was often fasting and he was old, but his thump was pretty vigorous, affectionate. So that is a memory, and I won't go into other details of how he did encourage frugality and economy and discipline in people like me, which he did with very clear examples. But the thing that is strongest in my mind, some of you have heard of his interfaith prayer meetings. There is this Interfaith Alliance that has invited me, and I'm most appreciative of this. But these interfaith prayer meetings were a feature of his life ever since he returned to India from South Africa for 30 years, 33 years, at 5 p.m. in the evening, wherever he was. Short prayer meetings which would contain pieces from different religions of the world. And at the end of this, which would take about 20 minutes, 22 minutes or so, he would speak for about 10 or 15 minutes about the burning questions that were on people's minds at the time. And sometimes, or most of the time, the newspapers would report what Gandhi was saying during his prayer meetings, which is his way of maintaining a communication with the Indian people. 46, 47, 48, he's in Delhi. I, 10, 11, 12, am also in Delhi. And I attend many of these multi-faith prayer meetings. I go a few minutes before they are due to start. I stay with him. I walk with him along with some others from his room to the site of the prayer meeting. He cracks jokes. We crack jokes. He teases us. We tease him back. But as soon as we reach the prayer ground, silence, solemnity. We are coming to sacred ground. And then these multi-faith prayer meetings. One of the pieces in the prayer is a short 1.5 minute passage, one of the opening chapters from the Holy Quran, recited in Arabic. And this is the time of partition, tension, refugees, killings. And some people protest. Not every day, but occasionally. We don't want to hear this. Stop. So I'm close to him, seated not far from him. And he's asked to stop the recitation of that bit. Because these prayer meetings are open to the public. Anybody can come. So some people who are unhappy, they make their objections known. So Gandhi says to everybody else, these people are objecting. What do you think? No, we don't mind. Please go ahead. Oh, see, these people don't mind. Please withdraw your objection. And they would occasionally withdraw it. But once or twice, no, we will not. We will not. Okay, I can't force this on you, but if you won't have the Islamic bit, I will stop also giving the Hindu bits. And then he would proceed right away to his 15-minute talk, roughly. So here I am, and this happens more than once. And I see that some of these people who are protesting are very angry with him. And they're perfectly capable of coming up to him and striking him. So I ask myself, will I be able to protect him if that guy comes here and tries to knock him down? Physically harm him? So those were the sort of questions. But I was only 10, 11, 12, but I learned one or two things. That this man, where people are speaking in a pretty angry way with him, but he's quite friendly in responding to them. He is civil to people who are not civil to him. And also, he does not yield his ground. He sticks to what he believes is true. So those are two of the most valuable face-to-face lessons that my grandfather taught me. Long answer to your question, sir.
I have a question. I want to
Yes.
go back, if we can go back a little bit when you were talking about the assumptions made based on what your grandfather pursued or looked at South Africa. And I remembered I was a little young woman growing up in England during the time when there were issues going on in America with the civil rights movement. We were more involved with the movement that was going on in South Africa. So we didn't, even as a person of color, a black woman, I didn't quite understand what was going on in America with the civil rights movement because we were more involved in what was going on in South Africa. Okay, so I just wanted to bring that context. As you were talking and as you were saying those who'd written information and even your interpretation of what your grandfather at the time meant, I think what the problem tends to be, and I don't know if it's a cultural thing or what it is, I think the idea of when we talk about reconciliation is about language and action. So I am thinking that even though the writings have been put there, it doesn't seem to be very clear in I am sorry for what I said. I recognize the time and frame in which we live. You know, for example, there's a movement that's called Black Lives Matters. A lot of people have their ideas of what they think that is. Years down the road, people will look back and say, oh, I understand now what Black Lives Matter was all about. So I'm saying of a great opportunity here, what may have helped to bridge that gap, because as you look around the room, you know, MLK and your grandfather were hand in hand, but there must be still some residue of did he really apologize for that, or was he being politically correct, or yes, during that time, that was the way to go? So how do we bring that forward now by the family members or whoever's representing would say, this is a public apology of what was said back then. We recognize, given the context in which it was, but we are now making a public apology for very specific. I think even that, it brings us to the reconciliation piece of that, if you understand what I'm saying. Because I remember Clinton doing something like that, and for some reason that meant so much to the community who felt that they were not recognized during that hurt and pain out of slavery. Obama tried to do that, and we see where he paid many prices for trying to bring reconciliation, harmony. So in closing, I'm saying that maybe you, your family, whoever's representative of that, to make that public, openly, saying, we are sorry, or on behalf of our grandfather, we are sorry for the content, for the language that was said. It has nothing to do with the day in which that was done, but as of today, we are sorry for that, and we move forward. I hope I haven't hurted anyone, but it's an open mic, right? And I'm just thinking that as a woman of color and have lived in many cultures, that just seems to work very well, particularly even for the African American community, when they hear, I am sorry for A, B, C, D, and we move on forward.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this extremely important contribution. And if my visit to Fresno has achieved nothing other than this conversation with you, I would be still very grateful for it. So thank you so much for those remarks. Now to the answer to your question. Gandhi was never confronted with those remarks. My understanding from his life reading, had he been confronted, he would of course have apologized. But he was not confronted in his lifetime. As I mentioned, nobody at that time, white, brown, black, in any part of the world, most of them hadn't even heard of because how did the world get to know of these remarks? Because they were all published when people collected all that Gandhi had said or written at that time. So people came to know. He was not confronted. Had he been confronted, in my understanding, he would have apologized. Would I be willing to apologize? Absolutely yes. Gandhi definitely made these uncalled for, unfortunate, offensive remarks that he should not have made. So I have absolutely no hesitation in saying that Gandhi should not have made those remarks. And if there is any slightest value in my expressing a wholehearted apology for those, I express that apology right away. And yet I would say that Gandhi's real attitude, yes, he imbibed some of the prejudices of the time, as Mandela said. Mandela said that he should be forgiven for this. So the reason why, as I understand it, people did not even confront him at the time, this is again my guess, I could be wrong, because Gandhi was fighting, within years, he was fighting for the freedom of South Africa. And the Indian government, led by his associates, Nehru and others, led the fight at the United Nations against apartheid. So the fight against apartheid in the United Nations was led by Gandhi's followers. It was a militant fight. It was an unequivocal fight, an unambiguous fight. So, and Gandhi wrote to Roosevelt in the middle of World War II, "What are you doing for the African Americans?" And the African American leadership, from 1917 onwards, there is evidence of how they were inspired by Gandhi's struggle in South Africa. In South Africa, Gandhi wrote in 1903 in his journal about Booker T. Washington. Now, today, not everybody thinks Booker T. Washington was right in everything, but Gandhi wrote about this amazing man. And he said the Indians of South Africa and Indians of India should learn from Booker T. Washington. He wrote about Lincoln. He called Lincoln the 19th century's greatest figure. And he spoke of how Lincoln fought against slavery. He said when people who were ministers of religion were defending slavery, when society was defending slavery, Lincoln fought against it. So Gandhi's fight against racialism was one reason why people, even if they had been aware of those earlier statements by him, did not tackle him on it. Hey, Gandhi, why did you say that? There is no evidence of anyone asking him that. My guess, as I have to repeat, had he been confronted, he would have apologized. Should he have made those remarks? Absolutely not. This may not satisfy you, ma'am, but this is how I understand that time. Thank you. Yes, yes.
Following Dr. Kennedy's question, which has to do with the present, I was wondering what Gandhi would say about the situation that the Puerto Rican people are in right now, trying to throw off empire, and how we as Americans can assist in some way, because we are all Americans. The Puerto Rican people who are fighting right now with debt, and the Jones Act, and the Patriot Act, and all these, not the Patriot Act, the Promesa Act. What would the Gandhi suggest?
I think there's no question that Gandhi would want to fight against injustices of that kind, discrimination of that kind, unfair treatment, unequal treatment of the Puerto Ricans. Absolutely, Gandhi would today fight on those issues, and I think we can be sure of that. And I would also maybe, since you're asking what Gandhi would have said today, this is an answer I sometimes give when people in India or other, what would Gandhi say today to this and that and the other? It's an important question to ask. But I think a more important question to ask is, what is our conscience telling us? Because I'm here not to say to you, yes, I do say that Gandhi still matters. But why does Gandhi still matter? Not because he was perfect in everything, or that he can give an answer to all the problems of his time and all the problems of our time. It is because we can learn from Gandhi's example to be true to our own consciences and our own minds. We must have the courage and the clarity to ask our consciences and our minds, what should be my stand on this issue today? Gandhi admired many people, he was inspired by many people, but when faced with a dilemma, he didn't ask himself, what would so-and-so have done? What is my duty today? And that is what we must ask. We will be inspired by Gandhi, but Gandhi is not our God. He cannot substitute our consciences. We must ask ourselves, certainly, we may be inspired by his example, we may learn from his example, and on Puerto Rico and the fight there, Gandhi would be with you, sister, all the way. Yeah.
So the two authors, going back to the South African Gandhi book.
Yeah.
So when I read this book, these two authors,
Yeah.
I find that the research is deficient. A good research gives both sides of the story. However, it has received great accolades by great scholars and is published by the Stanford University Press.
Yeah.
So my just question is, did you have a chance to meet, I mean, I like the way you contextualized, of course, what he was saying. We're not endorsing is what Gandhi said, but contextualizing it, what was going on at that time. Did you have a chance to speak with these two authors? First question. Mm-hmm. And the second is how to move forward. I mean, that's the whole idea. And Gandhi was, I think, the question here, apology. How I see it by studying Gandhi's works, I don't think he just apologizes in words, but through actions. What he's doing, my life is my message, not my words are my message. What he does with the Dalits in India, what he does when Thurman goes to India in 1936, how he treats them, and later on, and Reverend James Lawson, how he's engaging with Gandhi. So how can we bring that to a really fine scholarship to show the other side of Gandhi?
What a fantastic question, and you are the best person to answer that question. I mean, you need people in their 20s and 30s to answer this, not people in close to their 90s. But that's a great question. But have I met those two authors? No, I've not had the chance to meet them. Is their scholarship imperfect? Yes, it is imperfect. For one thing, I mentioned John Dewey and Albert Luthuli. For anyone to write about race and Gandhi in South Africa and not even mention Gandhi's relationship with John Dewey, not even mention what Albert Luthuli said about Gandhi or about John Dewey, and how there are other examples of how John Dewey and others spoke of how the way the Indians were nonviolently fighting for their rights inspired them in their struggle. So for that book to totally exclude that piece of information is, I think, poor scholarship in my opinion. But I have not had the chance to meet these two people. But I welcome the book. Imperfect, one-sided though it is, such books should be welcomed because we need to get an absolutely candid picture. We should know that nobody is perfect or prescient or far-seeing, always ahead of his time or her time. Although I would again say, read what Gandhi said in May 1908. It is a remarkable statement. So with all his imperfections, Gandhi had his illumination and his foresight too. But as to provide a scholarly answer to that book, that's your job, sister, not mine.